Howdy, everyone. All right, so another slight, well, it's not a slight, this is kind of a big detour that I'm taking, and I'm going to explain why. So, of course, I've been working on baffles. Gosh, it seems like I've been working on baffles for years, doesn't it? So, continuing to work on the baffles, you can see that I've got the black rubber seal now in place on this one piece. This is the right rear part of the baffle. And again, I've talked about an edge distance from the edge of the rubber to the rivet. And then, of course, you've got an edge distance from the aluminum to the rivet. These strips are roughly 2.5 inches, I believe, roughly cut to the same contour as the shape of the aluminum, riveted in place. I put some, before I put the strips in, I RTV'd. I used red RTV around each rivet and then a bead between each rivet. And then after it was in place with the rivets, some of it would squish out, which is fine. I cleaned that up. But if there were areas where nothing had squished out, I actually jammed some RTV up underneath it and then cleaned off all the excess. So this is sealed pretty decent. Once these are in the airplane, and probably after some actual flights, when this rubber takes a natural set, when it bends over and takes a natural set with the cowling, I may come back and add some more red RTV in here. I don't want to do it yet because my assumption is if I were to put RTV in here now and this were to bend and take a set with the cowling, it may actually kind of pull away from that RTV. So if it's going to do anything like that, I want it to do that first, and then I can come back and seal it if I need to. So this is the detour. So while I was doing all of that, I had shown and talked about the red RTV strips that I had put in here on these curved pieces that fit around the cylinder fins. There are 2 on this piece, there are 2 on this piece, and then you've got the front pieces that also have them, or could have them, I should say. The RV7 baffle instructions, well, I take that back. This is the 0360 cow baffle instructions. I was referencing this, and these instructions and plans don't say anything about that red RTV. But I also had a electronic copy of the RV14 baffles, and it was in there that I saw reference to adding those RTV strips on these pieces. So I had done that. It never sat well with me. The point of these is to force air through the fins of the engine cylinders. If these did not exist, the airflow would just dump around and between cylinders, and there wouldn't be necessarily any air purposely directed and forced through the fins. The red RTV would lay in here and would end up being perpendicular to the fins. So the fins of the cylinder go this way, the RTV goes this way. The RTV is soft. When you pull this around tight underneath the fins, that RTV is going to give a little bit. So now you're potentially wedging RTV between the fins, which is going to hamper your airflow. So I wasn't too fond about that. And the other thing was, this is now being brought tight up against the fins, but the RTV is what is actually on the fins. That's the whole point. It's to prevent this aluminum from rubbing on the fins and potentially wearing holes in this. So they put this RTV kind of as a rubber spacer. But now you've got gaps along the sides here because you've got the RTV spacer, if you will, here, 3 strips. airflow is trying to come down this way, it could potentially be hampered because the RTV is going this way. The air is trying to go down. Whatever air does get through there are gaps along the sides now. And the air, whatever air could get through, could potentially bleed out through the side gaps. So that just never sat well. And I decided yesterday that the hell with all of it. So I took all of the RTV strips off of these pieces and these pieces. My plan now is to, I don't know if I'll do like beads of RTV or if I'll paste this whole thing with a thin layer of RTV and then put these pieces of rubber. It's basically this baffle material, and put pieces of rubber on these curved areas and have it held in place with high temp RTV. Now the fins of the cylinder will rest on this, which will prevent this aluminum from chafing and potentially wearing through. And it provides a nice, even, flat surface to seal the fins, but still allow all the airflow to go through. And there won't be any bleed out through the sides. So I'm going to make rubber pieces to fit each individual curve piece. Okay, fine. But then I started to remember that the inter-cylinder baffle, this is the baffle that goes underneath between the cylinders. This came with the engine. Again, the engine is an Aero Sport engine. It was built but never flown, never ran other than on the Aero Sport test stand when the engine was built. I remember that these inter-cylinder baffles came with the RTV. There was a bead of RTV here, 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 and here. And it does the exact same thing. It's perpendicular to the fins of the cylinder. And they were from the, if you've ever had these in an airplane, if you ever dealt with these, you know what it takes to get these in and out. These are held super tight up against the fins. And the RTV was actually ribbed where the fins were cutting into the RTV. So the RTV was up in between the fins, which was preventing airflow, which could prevent airflow. The RTV itself introduced a gap, so now all of these edges were pathways for the air to come down, bounce off of the RTV, and bleed out the sides. So I thought, well, that needs to be dealt with. So I ended up taking these, well, this one anyway, I have to do the other side, taking these inter-cylinder baffles out, which was a pain in the ass because, you know, now I've got exhaust pipes and thermocouples and wires and fuel lines and whatever. So getting this out was a pain in the butt. I had to disconnect some stuff that I really didn't want to disconnect, but they're out. You can see I've got the RTV cleared out. I'm going to do the same thing with these. I'm going to cut pieces of sealing material, use some red RTV, put a layer of RTV on each of these areas, cut the seal to fit, and put this in all of these areas where the baffle mates with the fins of the cylinder. The other thing was, while I was doing all this, I was thinking about how do these pieces actually get attached. They use a tension rod to attach this one to the other baffle across the cylinders. And I was on the forums, and there are multiple ways to do that. So since the baffle, the center baffle, is out, I'm making some modifications to it so that when everything is back into the airplane, I can run safety wire from here to here, short length, and I can pull this tight around the cylinder. And rather than going from this cylinder to the other cylinder, I just go from this cylinder to the center, and then I go from this other cylinder to the center. I'll explain all that when I get into it. So Every time I think I'm getting close to putting these parts together, I come across something else. And it's like, well, I don't need to do this, but if I'm going to do it, now is the time. I don't want to put all this together and then start flying the airplane and think, wow, you know what? I should have done these changes because my cooling could be a lot better. So I'm just going to do it now. So that's what I'm doing. And here we are 10 and a half minutes later, and I'm still yapping. So this is still in work. What I'm going to do now is finish my mods on this. Once I get that done, I'm going to start cutting rubber pieces for these areas, put down some RTV, put down my rubber, and then I think at that point maybe I can start final installation on some of this Baffle stuff. All right. So like I said, I'll get into this a little bit more and explain it a little bit better as I go. And as I put it into the engine, I'll be able to demonstrate what I've been talking about. So thanks for putting up with me. I'll talk to you guys later.